Thank you for hosting me today. Actually, a little tiny fact, I was supposed to come here in Portland for my undergraduate degree, but my dad wouldn't let me. So he wanted me to stay nearby. So it's quite lovely being here. The city's wonderful. Thank you, Robin, for this very, very kind introduction. I'll give a little bit of a background as to what I do and who I am, just so I can better situate why I chose the topics that I did today. So, as Robin mentioned, I wrote one book, Neo-Traditionalism in Islam in the West, in which I examined the intellectual and pedagogical styles of three Muslim, American, and British scholars, namely Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, and Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah. And I examined how their critiques of modernity and their advocacy of a notion of a particular Muslim tradition impacts their political views. And I also looked at how their students examined these questions in the context of their spiritual and moral lives. Now, my second book looked at a very different thing. I examined with my co-author, Asim Qureshi, how Muslims incarcerated in Egyptian prisons and in Guantanamo Bay examined the questions of their faith and their practices within the carceral context. So we looked at, for example, how the very structures of incarceration impact the ritual practices. How do you make wudu in a place where water is limited? When your enforced disappeared, for example, how do you know where the qibla is? How do you know when to pray? All these issues, but also deeper issues of how do we conceive of God's justice in a situation of almost infinite injustice? How do we conceive of ourselves? Hold on, let me put this here so I can look at you guys. Yeah, this is better. So in a way, I'll try to merge these two themes together and sort of talk about different facets of Muslim American spiritual lives. But before that, usually academics, when they talk to you, they give you a very particular academic question that really intrigued them for such a long time, and that's why they produce the particular work that they produce. But usually behind the story of the academic scholarship and astuteness, there's a very personal story. And typically they don't like telling these stories because it makes them more invested and therefore less neutral and more of a sort of engaged scholar in a way, or bias in one way or another. I realized as I was doing my work that it seemed to circle different themes. The first theme that really struck me is the question of personhood. Not identity, but personhood. Identity is a part of our personhood, but it's not the entirety of it. I looked at how Muslims conceive of their own personhood, how that relates to community, whether it's a religious community or the community around them, religious authority, and overall crisis. But how also all of these themes and questions are made light through their complex relationships and sometimes expectations of God. You know, as Muslims, sometimes we do perceive that our relationship with God as through our understanding of Aqidah, it doesn't necessitate certain expectations, but subconsciously sometimes we do have certain expectations of the divine, whether it is for the divine to help us through certain hardships, or have an expectation of the divine to give us victory in certain situations, give us ease, give us help. So even if we don't articulate it in these particular ways, because it might hinge upon our certain theological understandings, subconsciously we do have expectations of what it means to be a believer and what it means to believe in the divine. So before, when I was planning this whole talk, Islam in America, Muslim institutions, the huge diversity. I think this was a part of why it was so difficult. Because American Muslim life is so tremendously diverse in terms of the different Muslim communities, if they've been here all along or they've arrived at a certain point, even geographically, like Muslims in Texas are very different from Muslims here, are very different from DC Muslims, their political beliefs, the way that they socialize their kids, the class differences. So I was going to go through all of that, but I wanted this to be a real conversation. So, and there's a lot of work that is incredible on this front. I mean, for example, the work of Edward Curtis, Suad Abdel Khabir, Zarina Gruel, Russell Miller, Maryam Kashani, to name a few. But I'll jump right into it. As human beings, we like to tell ourselves stories of how we got here, of who we are. And typically what went wrong. It's a question of crisis often. And this is something that I learned from my supervisor. He calls it the privilege of asking the first question. So the questions we ask ourselves typically, or society asks of us, typically inform the answers that we're going to get. So if I stood here, say 15 years ago, it would start as any conversation would start, with 9/11. What happened after 9/11, how it impacted Muslim communities. And the answers would have to do with how Muslims belong, whether they're integrated, the problem of radicalization. And in a way, these questions did not disappear, but they matured and helped form Muslim institutions in different ways. Now, if I talk to someone that is a Gen Z, I'm not, they would perhaps not know the very traumatic points that people that lived through 9/11 had and how it transformed not just institutions, but individuals in the way that they introspect. They would not know of the war in Iraq. They would know of it, but they would not know the particulars of what had happened or the anti-war movement and the very peculiar and particular politics that developed. So, for example, and the reason I think I bring this up is that I hope that it will situate a lot of the questions that even though we feel like we're so far away from that point, still underpin a lot of our ideas. And particularly the conditions of surveillance of Muslim communities. So to name just a few of the very important milestones that led to that particular surveillance, and it's important to also note that the war on terror did not develop in a vacuum. There's a long history of policing that led to that particular point, and there's an immediate history of the war on drugs that kind of situated the structures that then developed the mass surveillance during the war on terror. So you have the Patriot Act that expanded the government surveillance capabilities, their ability to monitor phones, email communications, collect bank and credit recordings. You had the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, which was implemented in 2002. This program required men from predominantly Muslim countries to register with the federal government, submit fingerprints, and get interviewed by immigration officials. Now, as all of us, pass through the different security processes at airports, it seems nonsensical or almost a given that heightened security would happen at that place, and that it's somehow just in terms of safety, and this is the price of doing business. But in fact, at that particular point, more than 80,000 men went under call-in registrations. Thousands were subjected to interrogation and detention. Around 13,000 were placed in deportation proceedings, although none were charged with terrorism. New York Police Department surveillance from 2002 to 2014, the NYPD's demographics unit conducted widespread surveillance of Muslim communities, including mosques, businesses, and student groups. And by the way, this mass surveillance of Muslim institutions helped or urged or pushed, I'd rather, Muslims institutions to develop in particular ways to ensure its internal safety, but also changed the dynamics in the way that they conceived of what is good knowledge and what is bad knowledge, what is useful knowledge and what is not useful knowledge. And then you have rather more coercive and kind of scary initiatives like the this notion of material support for terrorism, which again is a very legalese term for saying what are the basis on which someone can be charged under or criminalized for their connection to a terrorist organization. And a lot of people have been charged under this sort of material support for terrorism for maybe sending a text message or donating money to a charity, things that were very innocuous, then led to certain proceedings that criminalized Muslims or put people under mass incarceration. And then you also have entrapment cases, and this has been one of the most controversial dimensions of this. I think Human Rights Watch said over 500 federal terrorism cases since 9/11 were conducted through these entrapment cases in which federal agents would target certain vulnerable people, whether people that came from poor backgrounds or people that had mental health issues. And so that became dangerous on two fronts. On the very real front of actual people ending up locked up for reasons that they shouldn't have been, but also it created a sense of mistrust within Muslim mosques and communities where certain people were not to be trusted, or you're not constantly free. And if you grew up in a mosque, you'd hear all the old uncles with their conspiracy theories. I think that kind of trajectory that was created through these entrapment cases really persisted in the psyche of Muslims. Now, how do we really make sense of all of this in terms of spirituality and politics? Well, it really did impact Muslim institutions. Muslim institutions had to navigate these real legal and political concerns. And so you can think of the very legal issues in which Muslim communities or Muslim institutions had to navigate these dynamics with the state in particular ways that was not necessarily positive or conducive with the mosque communities being involved in counter-violent extremism initiatives. But also it created this mass fear of Muslim institutions in general in the wider American public. And so there's this issue of having to push back but also apologize, having to push back and also apologize. And so there's this constant feeling of sort of reactionary politics that sort of developed. But then there's something that I actually want to move away from, the inner dynamics of Muslim institutions and the structures, to look at the institutions of learning. How has learning transformed through these initiatives, right? And back to this question, this idea of the privilege of asking the first question. So if you grew up through the 9/11 era, you would have heard this, Bill Maher still says it, this very perennial question: why won't Islam reform? Why won't Islam have its own reformation? The Christians went through a reformation, and now we're better for it. Now we developed secular systems. We knew how to separate our religion and our emotions. We're modern people because we went through this reformation. Other religious traditions went through this reformation. We looked at our scriptures and we felt like yeah, it makes sense, but we don't have to take it that seriously in public life. So this question kind of loomed, right? Where, why can't Islam have its own reformation? And of course, for people that grew up in this time, it seemed to be a kind of compelling question, but also, this is what I was trying to hint at. Questions are ideological in their nature. They're not value-free, they're not neutral. And this particular question has had a long history. I mean, when Lord Cromer, the British governor of Egypt, was trying to sort of run the country through his allyship or tense relationship with the Gaddafi at the time, he had this particular notion, why won't Muslims reform? And he tried in his capacity to locate particular Muslim theologians and thinkers who he perceived to be closer to the reformists. But in his contention, and this is something Lord Cromer had said during the British colonization of Egypt, and Islam reformed is no longer Islam. And it goes through that very particular trajectory. It goes through the secularism's or a secular society's reading of how it got here, right? We got here through, there was the Protestant Reformation, and then we developed nation states, and then we developed secular law. There was an enlightenment, and now we're here. And so how are Muslims going to get there? So in my own work, in my first book, Neo-Traditionalism in Islam in the West, the sheikhs that I studied actually inverted this formula. They said, well, actually, the Reformation was not a good thing. It was a very bad thing. The Reformation caused bloodshed, violence, wars of religion, bigotry, and Islam has had its Reformation. And the Reformation, the reformists, the Protestants of the Muslims are actually the bad guys. They're the ones causing the bloodshed. They're the ones causing the violence. And actually, the more rooted Islam is akin to the depth and religious fullness of a more Catholic Islam, an Islam that is orthodox, right? But it still traps us within this very same trajectory. On the one hand, it presupposes a very particular reading of Christianity's move to secularity, and it's a very determinist thing, right? In the sense that because of a particular religious principle, that somehow it determined the modern reality be as it is, right? It doesn't, and there are reasons why this theory is very, very significant in modern sociology, and it has its critics, but there's a sense of determinism in the way we read the modern world, in the sense that religious values and religious ideals underpin political values, underpin political personhoods and selfhoods that present us in the way that we are. On the other hand, it traps Muslims into a particular paradigm that presumes that Islam's trajectory follows Christianity's trajectory, and that modernity or the modern world ought to look the same, or will reach certain ideals no matter what. And so this is kind of the situation that younger Muslims find themselves in. We live in a modern world, we live in a secular world. Secularism not being an absolute, being a complex process in which religion is allowed sometimes in certain ways, and religion is excluded in other times. Different forms of religion change over time based on modern consumption. And so you have this situation where Muslims need to figure out, okay, how am I a person who is contributing to society in terms of being gainfully employed, being in a public sphere, being in a university, and being faithful? how do I conceive of my faith as something that I could live comfortably in a context that hasn't really come to terms with how to navigate faith in the public sphere. It says that it has. It says that the public sphere is a neutral space. It's a space of rationality. It's a space of science. Of course, that's never really completely true. But definitely my faith is being perceived as irrational. Do I need my faith? And this was the question, you know, I'm not trying to bring in like jargon and stuff, but this is the question that Charles Taylor posed. This is the question that the philosopher Charles Taylor posed, where in his book, A Secular Age, his question was, or he argued that the secular age is not an age where religion is completely absent from the modern world, but it's rather a question, a context in which faith is an option amongst many options. So he begins his book by saying, why was it that 1,000 years ago, that it was almost axiomatic, it was almost like counterintuitive that someone would belong to a faith tradition? Why is it now that even if you do believe, you always have that hint that there might be something else, that it's not an absolute faith, it's a contested type of faith. And so Muslims navigate these questions and try to examine it in this very politically charged environment, in which on the one hand, you have the public space saying Islam needs to be reformed, and we need to figure out who these reformists could be, and what this Islam that is amenable to citizenship could look like. So you have that point. You have the other point where Muslims come in with their inherited faith if they hadn't converted to the faith. But even if they have their inherited notions of what religion ought to be, what God looks like, what a good theology ought to do, right? So we come in with all these questions. And what is it? How do young people then try to develop this, right? In a way, it's a question of construction, where there is this sense that like people that inherit faith just inherit faith, which is never true. You're always being thrown into these multitude of discourses about what is correct, what is false, what is reasonable and rational, what is superstitious and irrational, what is just and what is unjust. And you have to sort of understand or conceive where you situate yourself in that space, right? And a very significant push in a world that's telling you what to believe is to look for something that is authentic, something that is true. And truth is not something necessarily just related to doctrine, even though it is very much to do with doctrine. It's also about how we practice truth, how to be an authentic Muslim. What does an authentic Muslim look like? And this is where the question of geography really comes in, right? We live in this world where it seems like Islam is constantly constructed and reconstructed. Where do we find a pure Islam to model our Islam upon that does not carry these questions or this baggage? At the same time, as a Muslim believer, I'm pushed by different sort of pressures and pulls, whether it's my inherited tradition or whether it's my political situation telling me to react in one way or another. So when I did my interviews, one of the people that I talked to had brought up, she came from like a Moroccan Pakistani family. She brought up Bashar al-Assad, she brought up Syria, right? She said, it's something that really, really traumatized me, but I don't want to look at it. I feel like the political environment that I'm in forces me to constantly have an opinion about everything and be situated in a particular politic, right? And this could be an immediate concern, something to do with your own family history, where, yeah, these are my extended family. This is what's happening to my cousins back home, or this is something that is happening here in America, you know, but it's something that I need to have an opinion about. And how do I find who I am in a vacuum of all these pressures, right? And a lot of young Muslims, in the context in which I was working, react against this sort of ummah push, right? Where, because the sense of ummah solidarity is it's everywhere, right? And because the tragedies are everywhere, it's either that I have to be very, very politically conscious, but also conscious of the fact that I'm completely powerless as an individual, as a community, and live with this powerlessness throughout and let it impact my faith. Or I can take myself out of it and construct a religious sense of selfhood that will withstand whatever happens. So if the ummah's going great, I'm still a Muslim. If tragedy hits, I'm still the same self, right? How do I disentangle my political self from my religious self? And this is the context a lot of people have to navigate. Now, this question is always burdened with the fact that you can only take yourself out of care and concern for so long, because at the end, politics will happen to you. It's not something that you choose to engage with. It's something that you can choose to engage with, but at some point, politics impacts you, and it no longer becomes politics. It becomes a matter of personal lives. And this is something that, for sort of my interlocutors, for the young people I interviewed, was really, really obvious after Trump, right? You know, middle-class Muslims could kind of navigate themselves in particular ways. During the Obama era, some people had criticisms, but it didn't really matter that much. But during Trump, people were forced to take a stance, right? And now people are forced more and more to take a stance. And so this is where the theme of spiritual travel really comes through, right? I have a lot of friends that went to Egypt and you know, went on a whole spiritual tour and studied in Al-Azhar or studied in the halaqat in Al-Azhar, became sheikh this, sidi that, and then left, coming back to the West with religious authority, with a certain sort of power to tell people, or not power rather, could compellingly say this is what authentic Islam looks like, because presumably they were there in the context of an authentic Islamic institution, right? This is a sort of theme of how do we dislocate and sort of immerse ourselves in a context and sort of bring that context to here with that claim of authenticity. This comes with a lot of questions. So this is some of the questions of personhood and subjectivity that comes through from being positioned in the place that we're in. The other is the question of religious authority. Now, again, the question of religious authority has so many different dimensions, and different people ask the question of religious authority differently. Some people ask the question of religious authority in terms of sectarian belonging, or where you locate the legitimacy of your hermeneutics and your tafsir and explanation, etc. But there's a securitized dimension to it, right? The question of Islam and Reformation came with who speaks for Islam? Who are the true Muslims, right? In that 9/11 era, it was, you know, these are progressive Muslims who celebrate Thanksgiving, who you know, have the American flag, who speak good English, who don't have accents. They might have beards, but their beards are trimmed and they look presentable. They're not the back home imams who bring all these foreign ideas. So that became a trend, but with that came certain liberal values. These were not misogynists or sexists, right? Because that was the idea. Islam is an inherently patriarchal, sexist religion. And so the new good Islam needs to have certain liberal values that we see are attuned to our values, right? So on the securitized front, there was that. On the individual level, there was a question of, okay, I have my inherited Islam, or I have the Islam that is taught in mosques and pamphlets. It's not entirely convincing, and the political environment leads me to think about Islamic orthodoxy, or it doesn't necessarily give me the depth of knowledge that perhaps like other subjects at my university would. I study sociology, and they give me this whole reading list, but in Islam I have 3 scholars to look at, right? So that's one push at it. And so it did lead to a surge of Islamic education and looking at sort of an authentic Islam that is not just deep in knowledge, but emphasizes beauty and aesthetics in a way that we can sort of locate a good Islam versus this bad, ugly Islam that we find ourselves in, right? And with that came a question of hierarchy and authority. The Salafis, the bad guys, the Salafis and the Salafis, Islamists and whatnot, they rejected the idea of scholarly hierarchy. They don't really follow the chains of transmission in the way it ought to be. They ruptured this good, beautiful tradition, and they got ideas that are not rooted, right? So we need to develop this understanding of hierarchy and understand that perhaps what we conceived of as a democratic tendency is actually a tendency that leads to chaos, right? A tendency that leads really bad thinkers to elevate their views as doctrine, right? So the question of religious hierarchy and authority became something of a question of how do we conceive of who to listen to and how to listen to. And that was not just a question of religious doctrine. Like, there was an element of that. There are people that need to have studied particular traditions in a particular way to have religious authority in doctrinal issues. But it also morphed into a question of spirituality. How do we develop a Muslim spiritual self? How do we develop? Well, we need people who are spiritual to become spiritual mentors. How do we ascertain the spiritual mentorship? Well, they need to come through a chain of tradition. They need to have studied with spiritual elders, that have studied with spiritual elders, that have studied with spiritual elders, all the way to the Prophet, or all the way through the chain of Ali. And from that developed the very, Tasawwuf has always been a force within just Western Islam in general, but it introduced younger people to Tasawwuf. But with that came problems, as usual. The question of hierarchy then created this idea of, well, if the chain of transmission is, and this is the one thing that has been debated forever, by the way, in Muslim majority countries, if isnad is a way to actually protect us or protect the community, then why are we in the crisis we're in now? So the question developed once again where, whether it's certain folk lying about their credentials and then being accepted as religious authorities but not being held accountable, or spiritual masters that have the chain of transmission also being involved in dubious things. Well, how come the chain of transmission didn't sort of protect us? And it's this sort of question of, well, if we think of isnad in a different way, then the whole structure collapses. if we think of hierarchy different, then who will our kids listen to? Or who are the people that are supposed to be the religious leaders of the community? If we don't hold religious authority to a standard where they're respected and listened to, that will collapse. Another weird dimension to it is the folk that go travel east, right? It's that issue that I brought up. The idea that certain folks go to certain places. Before the war, Syria was one place, Egypt continues to be one place, Morocco is one place. And either they get these chains of transmissions or ijaza, or they attend halaqats, circles and whatever, and then they come back with a religious authority. Some are astute students and have come with deep knowledge, and there are 101 sort of examples of that, if not more. But others are not as, it's easier basically to embody a certain aesthetic without doing the work. So I'll give you an example from Egypt, because this is something that happens a whole lot. Someone comes back to America or the UK or wherever and says, I have studied in Al-Azhar. In fact, Al-Azhar holds open lecture sessions, open halaqat, which anyone and everyone can attend, right? You can go study with a sheikh. You can sort of pay a teacher to teach you Arabic, to teach you religion, to teach you aqidah. And they may have an ijaza and you are studying, but you're not affiliated to Al-Azhar. You're not an Azhari student. You don't have that particular training. Not to say that particular training sort of protects you in any way. That's another question as well. But then it's very easy to come back to the West to say that I am this person, and automatically you will be elevated to a position of religious authority. And some people don't do, like, some people do it maliciously, other people don't. Other people have just wanted to experience this religious life, and then they're put in this situation where certain buzzwords allow you to wield more religious authority and power than it could be, than it should be, and spiritual authority. And the internet makes this a lot worse, right? It makes it a lot worse in terms of you can mediate this religious authority by being online, by posting hadith, by posting quotes of the scholars, by posting pictures, and automatically people will assume you have a particular set of skills and you are equipped to give advice and opinion in terms of religious fatwas, even if you're not a mufti, on the one hand, but also in matters of spiritual lives. In this matter of spiritual lives where you don't necessarily know the person, right? So you can be a spiritual mentor to a wide public without really knowing who your public is, why, without knowing the conditions. And this is where the crisis, the contemporary crisis of like religious authority is. It's this, the hybrid of like a classical sort of isnad, chain of transmission, the feeling that the chain of transmission somehow protects you from not being false, because no one claims that, but kind of is a manner of protection from being dishonest or from being corrupt. And then also the fact that you can mediate a classical authority through the internet in a particular way, which is very consumable, right? And the way that I think of it, it unfortunately creates a contradictory dynamic in society, or in the young Muslim community, or younger people. It creates a lot of vulnerable people who are told that they need someone above them in order to ascertain and judge their, not judge, but validate their religious faith and practices constantly. And I'm not saying that validation is not necessary, but on every step of the way, there is this sense of constant anxiety about the need of authority to validate everything. on the one hand, so it creates an entirely vulnerable generation. On the other hand, it could lead a chunk of young seekers to become amenable to this like power dynamic, right? Where they can where they feel that they have power to kind of, tell people what to believe or actually abuse the vulnerability of people. And by the way, this is a new formulation of a phenomenon that's been always there. Like, I think, was Ibn al-Qayyim who wrote Talbis Iblis? He talked about this, right? The idea of like certain things, certain behaviors that are good, or certain actions that are good that could be moved or become a position that makes the person that has these attributes to be sinful in one way or another. I was going to talk about other things, but I think let's just leave it to there, and maybe a Q&A might be good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thank you to OPB. Thank you, Robin, Wajdi, Jawad, everybody here at Met. And thank you, Walaa. Actually, I read Walaa's book before it became published and then I had to have her onto my own podcast to interview her. So this is actually the second time that she and I have been in conversation. There's many things I love about your research. One of the things that I like about your work, Walaa, and I think it speaks to something that I like to call a kind of counterintuitive insight, which is that a lot of Muslims in this country, because I actually study Islamophobia and I've worked with the Muslim community for over 15 years. So while I certainly could not speak with too much authority, I think from a research standpoint, I do know some general things about trends, and especially of younger Muslims. I myself am a millennial and have worked with so many millennial Muslims, and it's so fascinating to hear you say how the war on terror just shaped the consciousness of a whole generation, and how Zoomers and young Muslims simply don't have that politicization. But to say that the war on terror politicized American Muslims is a misnomer, if not a paradox, because it actually depoliticized Islam from them, in the sense that what I get from your work is that there has been, at the institutional level, at the leadership level in this country, the sense in which for a Muslim to be spiritual, they are depoliticized. Or the type of spirituality that they get is meant to be anti-political, to be separate from politics. And politics, and I want to start with this as a question for you, is not really politics as like Democrats and Republicans. Politics is something different. Politics is sort of almost like the universal demand for justice on earth, right? Politics is understood in a classical sense, not so much as a kind of bureaucratic or like, do we vote, do we not? It's not like that kind of NGO politics that you talk about. Politics is actually a fundamental pinnacle of Islamic spirituality, but it has been removed from Islamic spirituality. Why is that, in a certain sense? And is that the same in other parts, or is that something that you see as very distinct to the American institutional environment, that depoliticization?
So in terms of institutions, I think there is a really, really direct sort of reason for that. And it's not just the context of surveillance or the fact that like a lot of institutions had to deal with the fact that there were informants, but a lot of institutions were not just criminal, like people actually went, like leaders of Muslim institutions ended up in prison for their charity work. So there was a purging of the Muslim institutions at that level. And so there was a real threat, there was a genuine threat at that point of how do we survive when this is a real issue, right? Where we need to kind of transform ourselves in which we can still be a sustainable institution, and not end up like the other folks who ended up going to prison or ended up being sort of debanked in many ways. And I mean, I'm also like British, so there was that also context as well in the UK where, yeah, a lot of Muslim institutions had to figure out a way to survive after, the war on terror, because there was a real physical threat to their survival as institutions, but also as individuals. So there was that. I think with the Muslim community and with young Muslims, there were two contradictory sort of trajectories. I think the war on terror, and especially the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, politicized certain sections of the Muslim community. There were, a sort of, what's the word? I forgot. Anyways, Muslim communities have always been political in different ways, and different segments of Muslim community, like the Black Muslim community, has always been active in politics in a very particular way that the immigrant Muslim community was different from. But in terms of how 9/11 impacted young Muslims, I think it led certain Muslims to be more politically engaged and have that sense of justice, because as a direct result of the increased surveillance and policing. And so people who fell victim to it or saw that their communities fell victim to it were engaged politically. But also, I think within different other segments of the Muslim community, it kind of became, political victimization is not anyone or any community. It's not anything anyone wants to face, right? And so how do I maintain my sanity, my selfhood, my faith, without being a victim, without being victimized? And so what it pushed a lot of young Muslims who then, either went to Syria to study or went to spiritual retreats and whatnot, is to try to find, to still have certain values, but not have it basically be the center or the core of what leads their religious beliefs to be, that sense of fighting injustice is not what centers my faith. What centers my faith is a sense of authenticity and authentic Islam. And there's a very convincing reason why people do that, right? Because political situations and political conditions can push you one way and then could push you the other way.
Yeah.
And so how do I maintain being faithful in a place where it's so precarious and it's so, it changes from time to time, but also when you feel like you're uniquely subjected or faced with injustice within your context, but also you have to think about the context outside you and how the context outside you informs the context inside. It could become overwhelming. And it's interesting because in situations where global political violence is normalized and it's something that just happens every day, it's easy to shut it out, right? It's easy to say that there were particular institutions that developed particular trajectories and were committed to Palestine and committed to fighting, dictatorships in the Middle East. It's easy to really kind of see this in a very ideological way that you can disassociate with. But we see the opposite of that happening right now, where actually this is happening right now. And so it's not a matter of this is an abstract violence that abstractly happens all the time and I have to constantly care about it. It's something that people are seeing in and that the mundane versus sort of everyday lived violence is something that really sort of impacts people. I always I think I was in another lecture and someone brought up the Uyghur issue versus the Palestinian issue. And I think it's a very interesting sort of dynamic or a thing to think about, right? Where like the concentration camps in China are something that happen and Muslims know about it, but it's an invisible violence. And so I can disassociate myself from an invisible violence, or I can be committed if I'm a particularly justice-oriented person. But if it's something that's constantly being seen, there's an element of, I need, like, this is something that is more personal in a way.
Yeah. One of the big themes in your book is disenchantment. And I felt that for folks that aren't familiar with this concept, it's a very interesting way to understand, given that today's event is about faith in the modern world, and given that a lot of scholars have said that modernity pushes people away from classical faith. Mm-hmm. And there's a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber who has this idea of disenchantment, and that religion needs to come up with strategies to re-enchant the individual back into its values. And so one of the things that Walaa studies is how contemporary religious leaders are trying to re-enchant religion. And I find that interesting because what happens in your 3 case studies is a quite hierarchical version of religion in which authority is structured in a particular way, in which the knowledge is ultimately quite difficult to master. Mm-hmm. Only a few can master it. And then you have the paradox happen where people that are non-Muslims in the West say, where is the Reformation? Where is the Muslim Martin Luther? And you made the interesting point a moment ago that actually there already exists that radical egalitarianism internal to Islam that had already happened in a certain way. And now in the West, a lot of people think that Sufism, which internal to the Islamic tradition is actually the egalitarian one. That's the one that's not hierarchical. But what actually you show is the opposite is sort of true. And I mean, that's difficult because for people that are born where Arabic is not their first language, there's a huge hurdle to mastering Islamic knowledge, without question. Yeah. In fact, I think one of the challenges for the propagation of Islamic knowledge in America is that you do need to go and study Arabic for at least a decade, at least, in order to come back and have, if you want to be an imam, etc. And a lot of American Muslim institutions don't have that learning immersion experience. So can you help us balance that notion of egalitarian access to Islamic knowledge in the age of social media, in which you don't want young people to just sort of be like a Facebook, like imam without training, but at the same time, a lot of the knowledge sources that do exist are super elitist. Yeah. And not only are they elitist, what you show is that they, in some cases, sap the sense of justice. And for Muslims in this day and age, with so much persecution happening in Muslim majority societies, it's so hard to think of how you could be a young Muslim and then look at revered scholars who are saying, actually don't care about politics, there's nothing you can do, retreat into this enchanted space. Yeah. Yeah. So they're trying to, a lot of what your work shows is that spirituality has become about a retreat. Say more about that and why the theme of enchantment is so central for you.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there are 2 parts, I think, to this question, the idea of disenchantment and re-enchantment. And so the way that I use theory, and it's a mix of Max Weber, he's the first, arguably, with sociology, there's always an argument that is he the first. But Max Weber, and then to add to that, Charles Taylor talking and thinking about disenchantment and enchantment and re-enchantment, and how that sort of works within the Islamic context. I think this was the kind of like a puzzle I was trying to think about or solve throughout my thesis. Is this, can we think of disenchantment and reenchantment in the same way, or should we at all? So I bring up disenchantment because it's the narrative of modernity that many of the sheikhs either directly say or indirectly allude to. And so I'll give like the sheikh's sort of notion, but I'll also kind of expand to that what these theorists were thinking. So the idea is, prior to secular modernity, the world, the otherworldly, the heavens and the earth were integrated in a way, right? The immediate action of magic, as Weber puts it, interfered in the daily life of individuals. So an example would be, if you're ill in an enchanted world, in a world that is pre-secular, you wouldn't need to refer to scientific justification to understand your illness. You would say it's, for example, bad luck, and there would be ways that are mediated through the church, through the hierarchy of the church, in order to understand this relationship between the world here and what happens to us in the world, and the other world. So basically, it's the intervention of magic, of angels, demons, and above all, God, in the everyday. So in the everyday, everything that happens is through that. And pre-modern people, or people prior to secular modernity, understood and had this unmediated relationship with the heavens. And so what happened with the sort of scientific revolution is that there was a boundary that was created. So no longer was the heavens the prime. You could believe in God, but you have to have a scientific or a sort of ethical justification for your moral values, but also for things that naturally happen. So if it rains, it's no longer because God willed it, it's because the weather forecasted it, or you no longer had to pray for the rain to come or for the rain to stop, because these things were scientific phenomena. They're not spiritual phenomena, right? And so what that created was a sense that human beings may very well believe in God, but ultimately disempower God from being an active agent in their everyday life. Now, this is the narrative of disenchantment. Within Western Christendom, it's the idea that the Catholic Church, the Church, mediated this relationship through different mechanisms, right? But ultimately, our soul, our very personhood, was blurred and constantly vulnerable to the forces of the otherworldly. So it's conceivable to think of possession, like jinn possessions and things like that, right? And so with the scientific revolution, that stopped. And within Islam, again, people were vulnerable to these forces. There was the intervention of God, and that kind of stopped. Now, there's a longer history in theory about this. So Weber actually says that it's the Abrahamic religions that first initiated the first wave of disenchantment. So pagan religions were the most enchanted, right? Because the intervention of magic was in everything. But what Abrahamic religions were able to do was to create an, so I don't remember the exact term, but it was either an ethical rationalization, ethical rationalization, in which not magic, but the singular act of God that was the direct intervention. And so everything else had to be mediated through other mechanisms that went through God. But you can't talk of magic, you can't talk of you can't talk of spiritual forces, without talking about the direct act of God. So this was the first act of disenchantment. And then, the Reformation further disenchanted by removing the hierarchical structures that mediated this relationship between the otherworldly and this worldly. And then with the scientific revolution and that boundary became sort of more thick. But what it left people in the modern world feeling is they felt the remnants of magic without really having access to it. So Charles Taylor, for example, talks about scary movies. When you're watching a scary movie, you know that this isn't real. But in that moment, you're scared, and so you let go of your inhibitions to believe that there's a certain force that's beyond you that could move you. And this is why modern people seek enchantment in music, in psychedelics, and a lot of alternative spiritualities. It's something that they can control, but in a way it does make them feel something, right? Now, it's a really interesting theory. It's really, really interesting, and it's very compelling. It's actually quite poetic. But I would argue that maybe the relationship between this worldly and the otherworldly within an Islamic context was not necessarily really in that particular way, in that particular order, wasn't organized in that way. And hierarchies did not have these metaphysical sort of designations that are outside rationality that justified the way that they connected the earth. So, for example, within an enchanted framework, kings are important because they created this link, this cosmic link between this world and the other world. They were that political manifestation of a spiritual authority. There are some sort of traditions within Islam that would argue that, but not necessarily. This is an argument that had. But also, the pre-modern world was also pretty disenchanted in a way. And you can even, when you look at pre-modern poetry, there is also this sense of longing, the sense of loss, the sense. So these are, it's really interesting because as modern people, we tend, this is one of our curses, we tend to think that we're very unique in every way we feel, in everything that has happened to us. Modernity is exceptional, and nothing that has happened before or that came before could ever compare to what is going on now. Maybe it's not as significant of a rupture. Maybe the world wasn't ordered in that particular way. That's one of the things I argue. But also, so the context is we were disenchanted. This is sort of the argument against modernity that the sheikhs propagate. Well, how do we get back these authorities and this sort of this magic that kind of intervenes in our daily life? How do we re-enchant modernity? Now, this is something that's really interesting because Charles Taylor, he argues that it's actually impossible to completely re-enchant modernity. It's something that is so far gone that you can't really get it back. But what happens is there's this nova effect where different, it's sort of like a crystal where different sort of spiritual beliefs kind of collapse and they create something bigger. But it's always vulnerable to this secularity in one way or another. The issues kind of creep at you when political realities and social realities kind of intrude, and you have to negotiate the feeling of enchantment, the spiritual fullness that you felt with a social reality that you live in every day, and political truth that you know, but also scientific truth that you might be comfortable with investigating in a particular space, but when you leave that space, they become really open to interrogation. So that's basically that's my argument in the book in terms of enchantment and disenchantment.
In a certain way, I wanted to ask you also, to build off the second question, because I know the first one was a big one, so you did a nice job answering that. And I do want to remind everybody that we will have audience Q&A, so for folks that have questions, be ready, or be thinking of your questions for Dr. Walaa. I suppose my question is more about the topic of today's event, which is, so young Muslims in America today, let's open this up and ask, what are some of the challenges that they're facing? And based on your research, you know, anecdotally, but also perhaps based on social science, based on maybe even polling that you've been looking at, what are some of the challenges facing the new generation, the generation growing up not in the shadow of 9/11, not having to define their Muslimness in relationship to that horrific event? You touched on that in your lecture. Could you say some more general things? You know, like what are we seeing a longing, the same type of yearning? Because I mean, in a certain way, it seems as if the security state that emerged after 9/11 probably drew a lot of millennial age Muslims to try to find a relief from that in spirituality. Is that same yearning still happening? I'm assuming that it is, but is it taking a different form? Does it have a different desire? Does it have a different direction?
Yeah.
Have you seen any changes generationally? Because I do think that politically, the American Muslim community is not really like most faith communities, not really allowed to exert their politics. Like we were talking before the event about how all of the top religious scholars in America, what's the thing that they argue about the most intensely politically? It's actually about like moon sightings. So there's nothing having to do with politics. And some people said, well, a sign of the health of American Muslim integration would be when the religious scholars actually talking about real political issues, as they do in Muslim majority societies. That doesn't happen here. So in a sense, the structure of American Muslim institutional life is profoundly depoliticized. But to my question is sort of like asking you, are you seeing any new trends on behalf of young Muslims towards spirituality that are different than millennials?
Yeah. I mean, so I don't think the yearning will ever go. I think it's sort of a part of like human experience. And I mean, even before the event, we were talking about sort of statistics of Muslims and who are more faithful, who are not faithful. I typically tend to stay away from like thinking of it in those terms, just because we have this inbred against secularization narrative where like things are linear, where human experience is a lot more fluid, and something that may seem to be true now will not be true in 10 years and will not be true in 20 years. We don't know what's gonna happen. So the yearning has not ended. I would say the taboos that were state enforced during the post 9/11 era have been broken in one way or another. And that's not to say that the state is less violent, but the violence is so pervasive and mundane. So like I was talking to a friend the other day, she's a public defender, and she was telling me about how terrorism cases are done and whatnot. And she mentioned just someone insulting someone on the street, and the judge said that, well, this is like, this is a terrorist act. So the idea of like terrorism laws have expanded well beyond the Muslim community as a way of policing society in a very direct way. And so what tends to happen when violence is so mundane and so everywhere is that the taboo and the fear is broken, and a lot of it has to do with naivety and age, not seeing it directly happen in front of you, but a lot of it has to do also with like just not caring as much. It's always hard to kind of judge what will happen in the future, but a couple of the trends that have emerged now, I mean, some positive, some negative, but sort of how culture war, like American culture wars and sort of right-wing online spaces have morphed within the Muslim community and created different discourses that are perhaps minority discourses, but very loud. And in a way, a lot of the religious authority tend to try to navigate and demarcate these discourses in so many ways that it becomes inadvertently like a primary agenda. So like the conversion of folks like Andrew Tate, for example, to Islam, that's really created a massive sort of upsurge. So that on the one hand you have that, and that becomes something that Muslims have to navigate and deal with, and whereas some of the suppositions that this guy might have sort of put out would be inconceivable to deal with like a few years ago, now you have to mediate it and understand it because it poses a question, right? So you have that, but also you have like what's happening in Gaza, that becomes a matter, and before that, like the issue of Black Lives Matter. These are, and it affects millennials as well as Gen Zs, but it affects Gen Zs in a very different way because millennials and again, depending on which millennials you talk to and what background they come from, they also have to navigate these issues differently. But like these are questions that people have to really engage with. But I think with younger people, a lot of the taboos, a lot of the sort of untouchables that we grew up with, whether it comes to religious authority, they're more comfortable sort of navigating it.
Right.
So, for example, when I look at people that engage with the mashayikh that I talk about, Hamza Yusuf, Abdul Hakim Murad, on the one hand, Sheikh Hamza has changed so much in the last like 20 years. So his discourse right now, at this very moment, is very much not something people who are 19, 18 can really relate to at all. For so many reasons, and it's not just political. Like the questions that he's asking, the issues that he's raising, the books he's mentioning, are not things that are really in the major concerns of for the most part, of people of that generation.
Yeah.
For millennials, it was central, right? And so that's one issue. These big sort of structures don't mean as much as they used to.
Yeah.
And that has its challenges and has its opportunities, as with everything.
I wanted to be thinking of your questions. I wanted to ask you a question. In my research, I draw a distinction in my research on Islamophobia between how Americans view Muslims versus how they view Islam as a religion. And I think that some people may say, well, there's no difference because Islam is this lived, embodied experience and so on. But I actually do think there's a difference in the minds of, say, like the non-Muslim majority, given that Muslims in America are about 1%, maybe 1.5% of the population. And so we're seeing a very interesting paradox emerge in which Gen Z will probably have a highly visible, successful Hollywood media presence on popular television shows, in movies, the representation of what it means to be a Muslim, therefore, will be portrayed in a lot of heterogeneous ways. The old taboos will probably therefore be lifted in some of these naive, kind of like knee-jerk, discriminatory, Islamophobic feelings. But at the same time, Americans, even highly educated Americans, still have a very poor literacy of basic understanding about the religion itself. And so I would argue that so much of, and I want to actually ask you how you think this might affect young Muslims, so much misunderstanding really revolves around the basics of the religion, where we're seeing like the secular version of Muslimness maybe more tolerated, or maybe more integrated, or maybe more permissible in the minds of many, but still, it's the religious dimension that is more difficult for people to grasp or to understand. I wonder if you agree with that framework in general, and how are young Muslims internalizing that challenge themselves? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So this is one of the things that actually led me to the question of personhood rather than identity. And it's something that someone I interviewed like really just made me think about this really, really deeply. But it goes back to the question of representation. And it's a huge, huge question because, so I watched Inside Out, I think that cartoon, and they had the hijabi girl. She was completely like silent throughout, but she was there in a cartoon. And I think it's so very interesting when you look at a lot of like the representation in the media, but even like stand-up comedians and the kind of jokes they can say and they can't say. So what I mean by this is that, and this is not just true for Muslims, it's for all like minorities represented. You are brought in as an image and your image is accepted. In fact, if your image is not allowed within that space, then that negates what the liberal frame now conceives itself to be, right? You have to have, it's interesting, like you have to have an interracial relationship that doesn't talk about race, right? So there's a mixed race kid that is a result of this interracial, no talk about race, you can't mention it. You have a hijabi person, but like, it doesn't, you can't talk about what this means. All the people are there, but their identities are muted. And that happens in the media, that happens in university campuses, where everyone is there, but you have to have a particular narrative that you propagate. And the only way you can stray away from that particular narrative is if you bring in your own narrative in a way colored by what that frame wants, right? And that's a part of actually like a lot of the rebellion against like progressive movements and whatnot. It's this idea of like, I'm allowed to be here as long as I'm quiet, as long as what I believe, what I say, and all of my particularities don't really exist. And it's the same thing with like stand-up comedians. I look at like a lot of these stand-up comedians and a lot of terrorism jokes, a lot of my immigrant mother jokes, even like these people are way into their 30s and 40s, like you don't live with your mom anymore, you have other issues. But like these are the issues that we perceive these like minorities to like have a mom that beats them with a wooden spoon and nothing else, you know, they don't have a job they go to every day and they can't complain about their boss because we don't see them in this fullness. So one of like the girls I interviewed, we actually became really good friends after this. She was talking about, so she was in I think Charlottesville when everything went down, and so she talked about two university experiences: her undergraduate and her graduate. Her undergraduate being in a very like white-dominated racist space, where she had to completely like be invisible, be quiet, and not appear because it was physically dangerous to be in this space and talk, right? It's not safe. And then she goes to graduate school, where you can talk, but you have to propagate a particular narrative and a particular mode of critique that is intelligible to the university, that is intelligible to particular frames. If you bring something from outside, then it kind of messes with the space. It messes with its intelligibility and its view of itself, right? And so you're allowed to speak as long as you say certain things. And I think it goes to the idea of like literacy, but it also shows how even like quote unquote progressive or even like radical issues become integrated within the logic of like this capitalist society and becomes a consumable issue. So you are a good Muslim if you can hit certain like check checkpoints, but not go too deep into that. But it also goes to other, like non-Muslims as well. Like you're okay as long as you can bring in your identity, but not actually what that means in a way that can challenge society in any meaningful way.
I mean, it's interesting for young Muslims growing up in an era in which you have the genocide in Gaza, you have these horrific things happening to Muslims overseas. Maybe the war on terror is more muted in their direct experience. I remember a campaign, I want to ask your opinion about this, that millennial Muslims launched, like around the time of ISIS or before, which is called My Jihad. It's called My Jihad, which was trying to reclaim the idea of jihad as a depoliticized, personal, spiritual concept, right? Which was like, you know, jihad's my struggle here living in America to get by. Maybe it's you know, paying the bills. Maybe it's like these more mundane things, which I found interesting because on the one hand, it's like this, these forces exist to block the expression of authentic, or even like you could say like holistic, like this idea of politics that you work with. I'm curious your thoughts on that. Like how might American Muslim young people actually reconnect with the calling of a universal conception of justice if they're not feeling that connection in the institutions or in the leadership structures? What would you say? Like would you have any like advice for young Muslims that are feeling like deprived of that? And maybe that is something that can be handled vis-a-vis grassroots. Maybe that's actually something social media can handle, because social media is not all bad, even though that is a whole interesting phenomenon, what you're talking about, this like post-Trump libertarian turn within Muslim social media spaces. I've seen it. I think it's very strange. I haven't fully understood it, why. It's definitely happening. Maybe you need to create a counterpublic to that. I don't know. What would you say, though? Because I felt that that's like one of the best things about your work, which is Muslims in the West are deprived of a sort of true political yearning. But it is there. That desire is there, but it's not able to be expressed. Or if it is expressed, it's highly regulated, right? It's highly controlled how it can appear. And that is difficult. What would you say?
Yeah, it's really interesting about like the war on terror being over. Actually, when I was working on the book with Asim on Guantanamo in Egypt, the publishers had told us, and it's a left-wing publisher, you know, like we can't really talk, like we can't put the war on terror there because people think the war on terror is done, right?
Really?
Yeah.
When was this?
I mean, they're not saying it in bad terms, but this is sort of, but this is the perception, you know, there's the war, we've moved on to other things. But it's interesting how these like deep sort of structures of violence recreate themselves and sort of revamp in moments where things are happening. Like at the beginning of the war in Gaza, like all the stereotypes, all of the stuff that, you know, we thought people have gotten past.
Comes right back.
They came right back. And by like progressive liberals, all the stuff about, you know, the 80 virgins and the jihad this and all the 9/11 discourse, it never went away. It never went away. And it all came back with like a vengeance. And it was so interesting to see that, again, like the progressive politics policed it in a particular way where you can't say certain things, but you kind of believe them. And that's why like stand-up comedians make these terrorist jokes, and they're funny because really we actually moved on, but we actually believe them. They're actually really true. So stuff never really goes away because the police state is still very much enshrined. It's still very much entrenched, and maybe it doesn't sort of, it's not obvious to a middle class audience, but like for people that are disempowered, people that can't afford lawyers, they're there and they're vulnerable to this stuff all the time, every day. And so it never really went away. I think, so there are a few ways that like Muslims are beginning to organize. I think there are big questions that I feel like people have been too scared to sort of question in any significant way. I think the one question is like authority and holding authority into account in so many levels, like the idea of holding whether it's religious, political authority, anything, to any form of accountability. People are still very much terrified, because if that goes away, there's a vacuum. Okay, if there's a vacuum, and sorry, I revert to my Arabic when I'm talking, but if there's a vacuum, how do we fill this vacuum with something that is productive, right? But I think that's still very much a question. That pull of authenticity that goes beyond what's theologically correct and theologically wrong is still very much there. People want something that has this aura of fullness and truth without investing too much in substance. And another thing that I feel like, and this might touch upon like elitism in certain spaces, and it's not just a problem that happens in America. You see it in Turkey, you see it in different places, where when we need to create this intellectual vanguard, how do we do that, right? And one of the ways a lot of institutions do that is by putting a lot of like artificial hurdles into actually getting there. So in order to get into so-and-so institution, you have to be fluent in 4 or 5 languages. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have your GPA. And so it creates a sense that the people that actually make it through are rooted in any particular way. And so there is a problem with the way we conceive of like learning and pedagogy in general, where it creates this artificial sense of like these are the elite vanguards, but like how did you teach, like what did you teach them in order to be critical enough in order to negotiate different ideas? And so
point.
what you have is just fear. Like, well, no, they have to be initiated into this particular way and into that. And so the way we teach generally becomes this idea of taking knowledge, but not being active agents. And that again leads to that issue of vulnerability that I touched upon. It's this idea of like constantly keeping like young people vulnerable to like authority and hierarchy, because we want them to be on the straight path, because if they're not listening to us, they're going to listen to the outside world, and if they listen to the outside world, they'll believe all these crazy things. And it's this sense of like you're constantly making dependent people who are dependent, who are not sort of thinkers.
Yeah. That's crazy what you say about how representation of Muslimness in mainstream media can succeed in objective and quantitative standards, but that will not promise necessarily that Islamophobia will somehow go away.
No, it really,
right? Because
and internalized Islamophobia as well. Like this stuff just it creates a sort of makeup to a very like. You have issues, and these issues, the thing about it is that these issues are not in a vacuum to other issues. They're the same structures that sustain different forms of like deep racism are connected in so many different ways. And so how do we as a liberal sort of, how do we do it? Well, we create a politics of politeness, right? We create a politics of like, anti-prejudice, of education, but like we're still, all these things are still very much intact, And unfortunately, because it's such a structured society, we all benefit from it in different ways that it's impossible to untangle. It's very difficult to.
No, it's kind of like systemic racism towards black people in the long tradition and history in the United States, because representation of black people in the media does not necessarily translate at all. There's not a correlation there, but I feel that a lot of people assume that for Muslimness, that there would be a correlation. But people learn the hard way after things like Gaza happens, that no, like it's not that way. I want to invite folks to ask any questions of Walaa while we have her, if anyone's interested. I still have several questions myself. We have one, please.
Oh, no, I'm inviting, if anyone does have a question, if you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone, or you can just ask with your voice.
Excellent. Robin, you can also ask a question, since I know you've been listening with great focus and intent.
I have. Okay. I do have one, actually, and I've been kind of thinking about it for a while, and it's about the concept of enchantment and disenchantment, because I find that fascinating. And it makes me think of the way that we've seen kind of a rise of interest in magic in a broader sense, and we've also seen a rise in the influence of the moon and the way people perceive, you know, their horoscopes, or the
astrology.
Way that people think about like tarot readings. And I think that there seems to be more of a return to this desire to connect with less religious and more spiritual. And I wonder if you can speak to that kind of on a broader societal sense, based on what kind of you have studied.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So so there's actually like a smaller book that summarizes what Charles Taylor is saying. It's by this guy, I think he's, I'm not sure if he's a scholar, but also I think he's in a Christian university named James K.A. Smith. He wrote How Not to Be Secular, and it's basically a very good summary of Charles Taylor's work. And he talks about like the 1960s and the hippie generation being the first sort of re-enchanted generation, but they're still beholden to secular values. So this idea of like we are spiritual, but because we're modern, we can sort of dominate our gods in a way, right? We have all these beliefs and all these ideas, but we're still kind of the center of the cosmos. So we're vulnerable to these forces, but we control what we're vulnerable to. And he says that there's a particular push within this generation where the lowest common denominator spiritualities are no longer fulfilling, because and I mean, they'll always be fulfilling in certain spaces, like companies have yoga retreats and have gurus to tell you how to be productive and all of that. So that's still something that is common, but he says with younger people, there is this sense that, well, the question of truth is erased from the question of spirituality within that like spiritual but not religious generation, where we can consume the feeling of spirituality, we can consume the enchantment, but not be moved in any meaningful way to do to commit ourselves to a tradition that will take away from our freedom, right? It's a spirituality where it's like a religion that constrains your freedom through doctrine. And he says that this generation is seeking something that is that the spirituality or the enchantment has a sort of consequence to it, right? And so this is where you see a lot of like younger people going back to like religion, or trying to form like reintegrate to traditional ways of being, but as with everything, this is a process that becomes complicated because, again, there are forces that inform spirituality and tradition that are bigger than all of us in a way. And so, for example, and this is what happens actually with the rise of a lot of traditionalist movements, like Catholic traditionalism has been really on the rise. And while you see some like people who are trying to veer to the most authentic or orthodox kind of forms, you have like imaginations of the authentic. And so online you see a lot of like these trad cultures kind of emerging, where this is what we perceive as the authentic that has its repercussions on our daily life. But yeah, I think within this theory of enchantment, the allure of enchantment never goes away, but it's always kind of in tension with the secular realities of society.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Hi, thank you for this great lecture, actually. One question I have about, actually I have more than one, but one of them will be about the hierarchy in Islam and in other religions. Why do we need it? And if it is there, would you be like a better person having really a good reference to tell you what to do? That's the first one.
Okay. It's interesting because, I mean, I think I've like shown my prejudice in terms of like,
Right.
I'm a little bit suspicious of hierarchies, but it has to be said that not all hierarchies are the same. I think the best types of authorities are authorities that are able to justify why they're in a place of authority, and are sort of a two-way street thing where if you're able to, the people you have authority upon are able to question why certain things are the way that they are. So not all hierarchies and authorities could be conceived as the same. Some are unquestionable, some can be questioned in certain ways and not others. So that's one thing, but I think the best types of authorities are authorities that can justify their existence and could be held to account by the people when need be.
Okay. The second one is, my kids were in the high school at the time where ISIS was prominent. And one of my kids came and told me, like my, classmate told me that actually what those people are doing is Islam. You are not a true Muslim. These are the, ISIS people, and how they work and how they practice is the true Muslims. So that was like shocking at the time. But then when you started and you were talking about 9/11, don't you see that there is always a pattern? 9/11 goes, then ISIS comes, then ISIS goes, then something else comes. Things like that keep repeat themselves, where it's more of against Islam as such, not as like the Muslims in America or Muslims in Europe or Muslims in some other places, where the religion itself is always under attack, not the people who practice it. Because the people, again, keep changing the way you described, and keep like, not manipulating things, but more of, find a way to do the thing that can work wherever they are.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point. I think this is, the important thing that is often left and willfully left out when, like, the war and terror and things as such are framed, is it makes these questions a purely religious question that is devoid of political context. The context of ISIS,
Yeah.
Iraq and Syria,
Yeah.
how did a sort of Sunni authoritarian kind of violent movement come about in Iraq. You can't really understand this without understanding what happened in the Iraq War. You can't really understand this before understanding what happened in the first Gulf. Like, these are things that are embedded within a very political context that have religious implications and have religious theologies, but these religious theologies are intertwined with the political context, and they can't be separated. It's the same with like Al-Qaeda. Like, these things are embedded within a very, very political context, and they came to be in a very, very political context, and making it a problem of purely religion reduces the way we can move forward as a society, but also reduces Islam and traps us into particular questions that we really, we become forced to answer a particular question without really having a free and kind of more fluid understanding of our faith.
I want to build off of this. Jawad, if I could ask a question, then you could go. We have a little bit more time. One of the areas that Walaa studies is what's called theodicy. And for people that don't have a degree in theology, don't worry, it's not too complicated. It's actually a very easy concept, and it's a very important concept, I think, for any practicing religious person to understand, because it's defined as what God makes permissible in terms of human suffering. And that actually connects to this idea of politics as justice. And I think that this is a very interesting theme that you focus on, because what it's about is how religious authorities present a picture of what is permissible and what is not permissible in the world of actual on-the-ground human suffering, right? So if you have a theodicy, therefore, that basically says that the world is violent, competition is valid, it's a state of nature, kind of Hobbesian vision of the world. Injustice is therefore sanctioned in some sense by God, right? And that actually gets to this question of hierarchy, because, and almost somebody say egalitarianism in some sense, because the theodicy question is where non-scholars, lay Muslims or lay Christians or lay Jews, I think, should question any preacher, any religious authority who's going to say that such and such atrocity is just the way of the world, this violence is just the way of the world. And that's where the intersection, I think, of power and religious authority comes in ways that can be very, very damaging. Do you see my point? When you have, and I'm not accusing anybody, I'm speaking in generality, in general points, but I think that we all know scholars and teachers that would give a picture of the world like that, right? Which is ultimately a very pessimistic picture of the world. And so, even though it's not the topic of today's lecture, one of your areas of research is on theodicy. Could you say something for the audience about what that means in a practical sense, and maybe relate it to American Muslim spirituality, if that's possible?
Yeah.
Because I don't think many people use that concept, but maybe they should, because it's a very helpful framework. Because I think that if you know what that means, then you listen to religious authorities and you'll know where they implicitly stand on it, right? In the Islamic tradition, the Ash'ari orientation on theodicy is so crazy. I mean, not crazy, but it's pretty intense in some ways. You know, like the three scholars that you study in your book, right? Where they literally do create a worldview that basically does say that human depravity, in some sense, and brutality is kind of naturalized in a certain way, or rather they can derive such a conclusion, right? Yeah. And you're very much opposed to that, and I think that's a super essential point.
The way that I like to study theodicy, and the way that I did it in my works, is examine how people in moments of crisis understand their moments of suffering. And it becomes really, really interesting, because in some of the cases I work on, so I studied the question of theodicy during the Rab'a massacre, right? Where there was no end. People were dying, and you could potentially die on that particular day. in situations where people were incarcerated. But then also, if we extrapolate that to mundane crisis or mundane violence, like things that like American Muslims or Muslims or people in other sort of mundane violent situations face, it's how do we construct different meanings that inform why God does what he does? What are the correct ways to act and what are the incorrect ways to act? So one extreme, on the other hand, is if you're facing injustice, then you have to, both put a lot of emphasis on patience, forbearance in calamities and crisis. One dimension would say you have to have forbearance and you have to be patient and you have to rectify yourself and not act, right? So that's one extreme. That's the sort of quietest extreme. The other extreme is you have to be quiet, you have to have forbearance, you have to act. But when you're in that moment of crisis, you have questions, right? And this is a part that theologians really, it trips them up, right? Because, I've spoken to a few Muslim theologians, right, where the question of theodicy, the question of suffering in Islam, is not as faulty or as problematic as it is in Christianity, so we don't have this question, we don't need to ask it. But actually, it comes up because it's a part of human experience. If I have, and this is what I mentioned in my talk, if I am a believer, then inadvertently, whether my theology allows it or not, I do have some sort of expectation of the divine. I have an internal dialogue with the divine through prayer, through certain things. So you do develop a relationship, and whether or not you have some sort of expectation. So one of the people that I interviewed that was imprisoned in Egypt for I think he was there for 8 or 10 years, he had brought up the story of Maryam in the Quran, Mary in the Quran, and particularly the moment when she was giving birth, right? And in the Quran it says, she said, I wish I hadn't been born and was forgotten. I wish I wasn't alive, right? And he said, if I was in a situation and talking to people and said, I just want to die, I wish I was dead right now, the knee-jerk instinct is to say, have you lost all hope and faith in God? Are you no longer a believer, right? So it's this idea that people that struggle with the question of suffering are somehow weak in their faith. And he said, well, in the Quranic message, God did not tell her, are you a weak believer? He said, eat and drink, have a date, shake the palm tree and have a date, right? And he said, well, what God was doing at this particular moment, it was divine consoling. He wasn't giving you an end. He was giving you a particular moment of consolation where you can be human, and the reasons will be uncovered to you later on, maybe even not in this world, maybe in the afterlife, but this is something that needs to happen. You are still an active agent into this. You have to go to your community, you have to face them, you have to do all of these things, so you're not completely beholden to what happened to you. You have to act. But right now, have something to eat and it's going to be okay. And so what he was saying, and I thought this was something that really, really struck me. It's this idea of what do we think about tribulation? And it was something that actually I heard from another sheikh, his name, Sheikh Farid al-Ansari, and he said one of the maqasid, one of the reasons behind tribulation is to actually just face tribulation. It's not to achieve an end. It's not to receive something. And it really does transform how you think, because violence and death are bad. But what death means in terms of a metaphysical or to God, what death means is not what it means to the world. When you die, It's a tragedy in this world, but it has so many different definitions, so many different dimensions towards God. And so with that comes the idea of what do you do when you face tribulation? Again, it's not a question of whether you're weak or you're strong, but what is this tribulation trying to transform you into being? Or is it trying to push you away and kind of keep you insulated and spiritually pure? And that's an instinct that like a lot of mashayikh have, where like chaos, where anarchy is really the terrifying thing, it's the bad thing that's gonna break up Islam, right? But anarchy and chaos always happens. It's a function of this world. Or is it something for you to be an active agent? And what if you don't succeed? And this was the question that came out of like the Rab'a piece that I wrote. What is it? What happens if you never achieve justice? What happens when they win, right? And so this is when Surah Al-Buruj comes in, the story of the ditch, and it's a story of the Christians of Najran who basically became believers through a young boy who befriended a priest, etc., etc. But they became believers, and the unjust king became enraged because they didn't believe in the same God, or they didn't believe what he believed. And he threw them in a ditch and lit them on fire, right? And so the idea is, well, this is the story that we need to actually think about in terms of theodicy. Is that maybe you actually, like in this world, maybe there won't be justice, but you acted still, right? And so the idea of divine justice is a divine justice in the afterlife, but it still means that you have to do something in this world. And I think the part about human action is really where it differentiates different ways of thinking about theodicy.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from Jawad.
Well, I was going to ask something, but then I got lost in the discussion of theodicy.
My fault.
No, and so many ideas of Ghazali and divine tests and everything else. But maybe we can have a lecture on that sometime. But more than, not really a question, just a comment on your book. And first of all, this lecture, and Daniel, this is amazing. I have a lot of notes from this for further discussion later on. But as Robin was mentioning, your entire book is, I read it in one go, but the idea of enchantment and disenchantment, what Weber brought out, and then you touched upon something in your lecture about a return to trad cultures, which I think dovetails in nicely with this entire idea, because Weber also talks about when you have this post-industrial society and how alienation and disillusionment for people, because now all of a sudden, instead of having a very defined role of what it means to be a man or a woman, a successful man or woman in a traditional society, you take care of the farm, or you have very limited roles and definition of success. And then now in this post-world, and for us now even more, you have all these other senses. You have an aesthetic sense, you have this sense, you have this sense. So in every single way, there's more possibility of falling short, and that falling short of disappointment, disillusionment, alienation. But I thought it was really interesting, the comment about trad, because in the Islamic orthodoxy, there really is no, purely from a philosophical point, there's no disenchantment, because God's Tawheed is ever present, and then all the signs are ever present, which is supposed to renew, which on the theoretical sense, yes. In the practical sense, there has to be that some spark that creates that enchantment, even if we're going to use that in that sense. And I think one of the things that we've seen, and you mentioned it about return to some trad norms, but also in the Muslim world, especially here in the United States, has been this idea of reconnecting with nature.
Yeah.
There's Islamic ideas about the environment that predates any Western ideas. But more than that, about this connection with nature and seeing God's signs as it was revealed in the Quran, because in the early surahs especially, it discusses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses about, look at this, look at the stars, look at this. And you had a different world where everything was wide open. Out in the desert, you look up, you see the entire stars, you see the vastness of creation. You also see how delicate everything is and how fragile everything is. But I think we're seeing now this type of thing without people understanding, yes, it's this idea of reigniting that enchantment, that first enchantment that you have. So if you haven't had a chance to read Dr. Walaa's book, it's an amazing book, start to finish. And thank you so much for being here and providing this lecture for us, and Daniel for facilitating this.
Thank you so much. When you were saying that, I remembered the moon sighting wars, because a part of it is that, right? How do we really how do we derive rulings? It's through our sort of relationship with nature rather than sort of a scientific, like nation-state based way, right? So it was really interesting when you mentioned that. Also, the trad culture thing is super fascinating because, again, I feel like every age, we always feel unique in our in the things that we face and in the solutions that we come up with. But like, I remember talking to people from like my parents' generation, and a lot of like the Islamic school ideas were, okay, how do we protect our children from like these other issues that are coming up? Let's start an Islamic school. And then the generation after that is, how do we, schooling is failing, how do we protect homeschool? So all these like questions constantly keep up, and like the solutions that work for them are still working, and the problems that were faced back then still come up. So yeah, like a lot of like, you know, these early like Muslim school initiatives, a lot of like the problems that, like the logistical problems that came up for them still come up for the folks that are very committed to homeschooling. You know, whether it's how do we sustain funding or find people who are skilled enough to teach our kids biology or chemistry, still come up. So it just feels like it's interesting how we're constantly put in this place where we feel like we're unique in our problems, we're unique in our solutions, and we're unique in everything we face. But certain dynamics just keep on repeating themselves over and over, but we give them different names.
Yeah, I suppose also the rise of trad counterpublics in online spaces is brought about by the Zoomification of the world post the pandemic. And the issue of authority there is interesting because it functions, speaking of Max Weber, on a model of charisma over authority. But I think one of the main themes that I want everyone to walk away from tonight is this very subtle point that is present in Walaa's book, which is counterintuitive to how we understand religious authority. Because a lot of the times, the frameworks of how that's presented to us conceals a model of authority which can actually be a bit pernicious, in fact. Pernicious insofar as it's actually not based on a model that would allow empowerment from below. That's not to say that all Sufism is like that, or its causes, I think, are different and more unique than that. But I do think, to Jawad's point and to Robin's point, this feeling also is tied, the turn to re-enchantment is also tied to the fact that our generations are now facing the consciousness of the possibility of the end of the world vis-a-vis global climate change. And so it's not a surprise that we will unconsciously seek out forms of reconnections with nature in a way which would be urgent, right? Which would be seemingly necessary to do, and we would take any means necessary to do that. So we're faced with the anxiety of our own mortality, but we're also faced with the anxiety of our collective mortality at a level that we've never been faced with before. And I think that Islamic religion in particular has so much to offer humanity in that existential crisis point. You know what I mean? And I feel that Walaa's work is very interesting because for a new generation, it can help. Like, I think one of the consequences of your work, right, is that maybe young Muslims can learn something about the nature of authority itself, which is not always apparent. Like, so your work helps tease out structures of authority that you wouldn't assume to be problematic, but actually kind of are in a certain way. And that's actually very hard because there's nothing more difficult than rebelling against a mentor or an idol. But maybe a final question for you, or unless someone else has a question, is sort of, what does it mean to actually think independently? Like, is that sort of something that you have come to value in your own Islam, in your own religiosity? That's one of the conclusions I'm getting from your work. Is it independent thinking? Is it that kind of autonomy? Is that sort of where you want to inspire younger Muslims to go, perhaps, in that direction? Have you thought about it that way? Is there sort of like perhaps maybe even like a prescription in your research where you're sort of saying, actually, this is something I would want to inspire in my reader, right? This is something I would want my reader to conclude, right? To challenge authority in a way which is robust, which is real, which is rigorous and authentic, maybe? Have you thought about it that way?
To an extent. So again, when I was doing my own work, I came across like Harold Bloom's work on like...
the Shakespeare guy.
Yeah. on
who recently passed away. He's an incredible scholar. And he wrote a lot about mysticism.
Yeah. Yeah, on influence. That's what I was interested in.
Kabbalah.
Influence. Yeah, kind of, but sort of. So the way that I didn't read everything, but there was a particular kind of idea, and Edward Said had written a review on it that was really, really interesting. Sort of the anxiety of influence. That was the point that I was really interested in, and it's this idea of like there is that model, but then there is another model where we think that we're completely independent of forces and actually like thinkers that are coming up with something new, but we're constantly dependent on canons in order to justify and understand. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think actually it's a little bit, in a way, it's a little bit more difficult, but it's somewhat more modest than kind of claiming that we need complete independence in our thought. But I think there is a couple of things that, in terms of how we think of independence or autonomy, that I've concluded were perhaps the way we need to conceive of these things. We don't exist in an intellectual vacuum. We imbibe all these ideas, but how do you construct an individual that is able to take on and actually critically assess what ideas they like and what ideas they don't like? And I think one of the things that came to me was young Muslims are starved for intellectual and spiritual mentors, that when you are presented with a discourse that's intellectually rigorous, you imbibe it in a way without stopping to think, well, what is the ultimate conclusion of this particular discourse? I think so. There was a point where this Moroccan scholar Taha Abdurrahman became very, very popular. Right? He's awesome.
The Moroccan
philosopher.
Yeah.
He's wonderful. But everyone became obsessed with him. Why? Because he wrote at a level of high intellectual.
Yeah, he wrote about contemporary philosophy,
just everything.
Western philosophy, everything.
And you know what? It's okay to engage with all different ideas, but I think the point that gets lost is how can we construct, or how do we develop a sort of critical eye where we can engage with a wide plethora of ideas that can be contradictory without falling in love with everything, and being able to position and situate ourselves as kind of people who discern, because you know what tends to happen? I mean, when you start sort of like studying classical Islam, right? Like what the Mu'tazilites said, people give such convincing arguments, and you can kind of be drowned by like the complexity of it all. How do we develop a critical eye in which you can understand and be a sympathetic and productive reader, but not take upon every idea that is presented to you? How can you see authority, but not feel obligated to be bound by it, right? How can you not be destroyed if an authority figure turns out not to be an exemplar? I think these are the things that really destroy people. And it does go back to this question of like, the tides move us this way, the tides moves us the other way. How do we develop the skills to actually be people who are Muslim at the end of the day? Do we hide? Do we run to the mountains? And that's the argument that, like Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad would argue, right? Run to the mountains and protect your deen. Or do you develop skills where, again, you might fall in love with an idea and you can fall out of love with it. It's okay. But how do you develop these critical methods without, again, like completely disassociating with your traditions, with your background? I think one of the things that I developed throughout my PhD journey is like real sympathy for like the sort of immigrant experience, like real sympathy, right? You come up with, and there's this, like, you're young and you feel like, okay, they did this and that wrong. The masjid boards are corrupt, blah, 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 blah. Again, growing up partly in the UK, like seeing how really working class people who came with nothing built these incredible structures. They made mistakes. How do we learn from these mistakes without like vilifying, and knowing at the same time that actually you also have limitations and you'll also screw up in significant ways. So it's developing this empathy with the past, with everything around you, but maintaining that you can actually be critically as not as a means of critique, but be discernible in the way that you interact with ideas, with ideologies, with belief systems, without completely leaving them away, without completely imbibing them whenever something like shinier comes about.
Right, and also that knowledge is also distributed, right? So if a sheikh may not know everything about United States imperialism, right? But the professor of United States imperialism might know more. And so there's that idea. And I think the other notion of fetishism, of not fetishizing people, putting them on a pedestal, because when you do that, if they make an error in their personal life, then that becomes like soul crushing for you. But that's very hard to do, because the truth is, and this is across, I think, all religious traditions, a leader, a mentor of spiritual knowledge is elevated. I mean, there's no way around that, right? There's no way around that. I guess it's a matter of degree, perhaps, of intensity that you choose to invest in, and humility. I get the sense of what you're talking about. There's a certain humility that you should have. So that's all very, very great. I'm so happy that we have this recording for distribution, for folks to learn from your insights. Can you tell us, in conclusion, Walaa, a bit about what your next project might be, what you're working on at the moment, and also how people can get a hold of your book on Neo-Traditionalism for those that want to learn more about this study, which incorporates this was your dissertation at Oxford, and incorporates a huge study about the theological origins of the three probably most prominent Islamic scholars and propagators of Islamic knowledge in the West, but then it's also grounded in this really rich ethnographic research. So how can people get a hold of it, and what are you working on in the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, thankfully, alhamdulillah, the book is open access through Edinburgh University Press website. So if you write Neo-Traditionalism in Islam in the West, you can get it for free on PDF. University presses usually mark up the prices.
Did you decide to do it for free? Or was this?
I mean, I hoped, but no,
That's great,
they
'cause
got
that's
a grant.
very rare. They often don't do that.
Yeah. The press got a grant that was able to make it.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it was very lucky, alhamdulillah. So you can you can get a PDF online easily. I'm working on prison theology right now, so complete opposite of
What was it again?
Prison theology, carceral theology.
Right.
So the book I wrote with Asim Qureshi was on Egypt and Guantanamo. It was purely a sort of ethnographic, low to no analysis. Very like anyone can read it. It has it's very accessible in its language. It does, like, there's a lot of trigger warnings, but I think it's something that anyone can read. I am still working on prison theology, but looking at it from different contexts, hoping now to look at it through the context of Saudi prison systems as well. So looking at Egyptian prisons and Saudi prisons from the 1980s to the present, and how different people from different sort of political persuasions deal with like religious legal structures, but also how they navigate their own spirituality in that particular context.
Wow. And then the United States prison system has which I've had the chance to teach in prisons before myself, philosophy. And of course, as you know, I was once teaching in Washington, D.C. During Ramadan. Guess the percentage of people in the jail that were observing Ramadan? 75%. Wow. Isn't it incredible, right? Huh. But you don't focus on the U.S. context too much.
So Asim wrote the Guantanamo Bay section, so it's sort of...
I get that. It's technically, right.
But so this is this is something that I'm hoping to do, but it's, again, really this initial phase. But I think, so there are people that have worked in different contexts to different degrees. I want to sort of help create a network of people who work on these contexts. I think the traditions in U.S. prisons are so vast.
Right.
And there are a few books there was a book that Muslim litigation that actually came out this year that looks at how sort of Muslims were able to change certain legal precepts on religious freedoms within U.S. prisons. So there's stuff that is out there already, but I feel like there are people that definitely have way more knowledge than I do into the U.S. system. But I'm hoping to bring together a network of people to work on this from different sort of backgrounds. One other background that I fascinating, the South African Muslims during apartheid. And Imam Harun was one of the leading anti-apartheid people. He was executed. And so they have a long history, the Kashmiris right now. So there's just so many in different contexts.
Palestine.
Palestine, there's an array of scholarship on Palestinian prison work. Actually, when I first started working on, so I wanted first to have it purely on the fiqh of incarceration, so fiqh practices in prison. And the only book that I found in Arabic or in any language that dealt with fiqh issues in prison was a Palestinian case. So they went through the debates on ritual purity, on hunger strikes and resistance, the gender. So it's a very, very rich field. Sorry, just to be rambling on, one of the really unique issues that came up in Palestinian carceral theologies is the case of smuggled sperm, where Palestinians smuggle their sperm outside of the prison in order to have families outside. So Sharia courts in Gaza had to be, and in Palestine had to be involved, and how do we navigate and negotiate this particular issue. So there's just some really, really interesting work that's already happened within the Palestinian context.
That's amazing. Well, I want to thank OPB. I want to thank Muslim Educational Center, MET, for hosting us. I want to thank Dr. Quisay. This is a lecture that's part of American Muslim Pathways, which is a project launched by my company, Unity Productions Foundation, and funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So you can check us out at AmericanMuslimPathways.com, where we have about 15 lectures on the history of Islam in America. Dr. Quisay's fits sort of at the latter part on the contemporary, but some other really fabulous talks people can check out on the website. So please put your hands together and round of applause. Thank you. Have a great night.